Hello, welcome to today's webinar on disaster recovery, ensuring operational resilience. My name's Lee Biggenden. I'm the co-founder of Nephos Technologies. Joined today by David Byers, Senior Field Technologist at Haiku and part of the CTO office over there. Thanks for joining us, David.
You got it.
Pleased to have you. I guess before we introduce ourselves, just to give a little bit of an introduction to Nephos for those people that don't know us, that are listening. We're a consulting-led data services integrator, essentially working with UK and global customers of all different shapes and sizes across a couple of core disciplines. So part of what we do is around infrastructure and high-performance infrastructure. We have a stream of the business around data governance and also privacy, risk and compliance, and ultimately supporting customers through a combination of consulting services, technology delivery and managed services. We've asked David to join us today really to add his market insight to some of the challenges that he's experienced through working with various customers across the globe, and centered really around what is obviously quite a hot topic for most organizations right now, and that's that kind of disaster recovery and operational resilience aspect that's top of mind for a lot of organizations. Again, thanks for joining us, David. As a starting point, it'd be great if you could introduce yourself to the audience, if that's all right.
Sure. So as Lee said, I'm the Senior Field Technologist at Haiku. Brief history in my background. I was a sysadmin for a number of years. One of the organizations that a lot of people know here in the United States is called Citadel Investment Group. They manage billions of dollars worth of other people's money. When I had worked there, and I was part of this IT team on the Linux Unix team, we were all about recovery and making sure we had absolute no downtime. So even though we might have had uptime of 99.99, and you think that's really good, we had to push ourselves to 7 nines because we associated any minute of downtime to a dollar figure. And so when you're managing billions of dollars worth of investments, 1 minute of downtime is a lot of money. So we were super robust. From there, I worked at Commvault. I was a Commvault SE for a number of years. It was close to 10 years. I worked for a data domain. I did a little bit of work at Cohesity. Right before I came to Haiku, I worked at Veeam. I was actually recruited to come to Haiku. And one of the things they liked about me was my vast experience when it came to data management, data recovery, data resiliency, data protection. And what they wanted me to do is to actually come in and develop what we call R-Score. And we'll talk about that a little bit later in our conversation. But R-Score basically is a tool that we can actually use, which is an assessment that Nephos Technologies has access to, but allows you to actually do an assessment to find out how well you can actually recover if you're hit with a ransomware event.
Excellent. Thanks, David. So I guess to set the scene, and we were just talking about this slightly beforehand, and when we look at the market at the moment, and to me, it seems to have exploded since COVID, is the volume of kind of ransomware, malware attacks that people were experiencing. There's some stats on screen at the moment, but ultimately, I think what we can all agree is that it's top of mind for most organizations. And I think for me, the part of the biggest challenge with a lot of this is we spend millions of dollars across the globe on kind of protection and trying to stop these things. And really, actually, part of the biggest challenge is the cleanup element, right? The fact that when we're faced with these sorts of issues, the cost of cleanup is so high. The time, I think it's on average, it's something like 21 days to recover from an attack. But we were just talking briefly, there's a customer I was talking to only a week or so ago, and they've been in the trenches for about 6 months trying to clean up this mess. And to me, I think that's a big part of the problem that we're all facing. And I guess from your side, David, is this these sorts of stats, this is what you're seeing generally speaking across the board?
Yes. Yeah. I think when people look at a ransomware event, I think they think in terms of what is the dollar value that a cyber criminal is asking for to get their data back. I tell people, first of all, you might call them a hacker. They're a criminal, right? So when you pay this amount to try and get your data back, there's no assurance you're going to get all of that data back. Why? Because you're dealing with a criminal. The other thing too, and Lee, when we talk about the dollar figure, it goes about well above and beyond what someone is asking for as far as here's what you have to pay to get your data back. Lee, as you mentioned, 21 days. That's a lot of recovery time. So if we want to consider soft costs to try and get our data back, and it takes you that long, it's going to go above and beyond what that dollar figure that the hacker wanted, right? It goes well above that.
Yeah, and I think as well, I guess the unquantifiable number that most people have is around brand reputation, right? If you look at some of these organizations, and we know of a number that have fallen foul of this over the last kind of 24 months in particular. And actually, if the brand impact to the business is potentially huge, and it's not really quantifiable, right, until it actually happens. But ultimately, I think these attacks are just becoming more and more frequent. And I do also think I saw something recently. In fact, we may have spoken about this before, but the use of AI technologies to build these exploits in super quick time.
You read my mind. I was thinking the same thing.
You can go on the internet and buy an exploit for $50.
Yeah.
It's so easy. It's not script kiddies anymore, right?
No, I actually read about this hacker. He's now on the dark web. And basically what he's doing, he's asking for someone to give him like an annual payment. That annual payment opens it up to this AI bot that he actually built to help them develop code faster to attack people.
I mean,
it was cheap. It was like $9 a year subscription.
Really? $9 a year. $9 a year. Wow.
Yeah,
wow.
Exactly.
And I think it's only going to get worse, right? It's only going to get worse. So I think, and I guess when we look at these things, for me, and I wouldn't ever suggest that protection, detection, prevention tools, XDR, NDR, all of the layers of security that organizations have put in place are wasted. But to me, it's only part of the resolution. Like more and more, I was with a customer recently, and we were talking about this, and they said, you know what, we've given up trying to stop it. Like, we spend money to try and protect ourselves, but we know that we're gonna have a breach, we're gonna have an incident at some point. We cannot stop everything. It's not possible. So they're trying to shift their paradigm internally into saying, yeah, from an InfoSec perspective, we need these things, but actually our focus needs to be on recoverability.
Yep.
We need to be able to protect ourselves and bring ourselves back into operation a lot faster than we currently do today. And I think that's a bit of a change. And I'm not sure if it's what everyone's thinking. I don't know if it's something how you see it, but I've seen it more and more.
Yeah. So I've been in the industry long enough to where I've talked to a lot of people, and they said, we already have preventative tools. We also have tools that do detection. They build their own scripts looking for anomalous behavior, or they've got artificial intelligence that is looking for these things. But when I ask people to step out of the prevention detection mindset and think about recoverability, if you've heard about the LastPass hack, LastPass, obviously, they were hacked. I was a LastPass user, and my vault was stolen. So the thing that they had to worry about was the recoverability aspect of it. I wouldn't have thought that someone like LastPass would actually be hacked. I would think that they would have all their prevention tools in place, detection tools in place, and no one was going to get by those things. They did. How was it done? It was a social engineered attack. Those are the ones that you can have the best preventive tools, detection tools. It doesn't matter how good that is. If they get past a single user within that organization, i.e. that was one of their developers, and they used a social engineered attack, and that's how they got through. So Lee, you're absolutely right. It's the recoverability piece that you now have to worry about. Can you actually recover now because you've been hacked?
Yeah, and I think as well, these hacks are getting getting smarter. Now, we're not seeing people just say, we're going to all your data, but you know what? We're going to go after your directory services. So you just got to look at what's happened with Okta recently, that they're going after those softer targets that really are crippling rather than just purely the data themselves. So I think that's a big change in mindset, really. So I think when we look at these things, and what we're going to go through some of these, is this kind of, I guess, it's a little bit like a three-legged stool, right? It's the people, process, technology. It's not just tech. It's not just detection, prevention. We need strength in depth, and we need a layered defense to these things. And you'll see on screen now there's 6 core elements there that we're gonna walk through. And the first is that detection and prevention piece. We've touched on this slightly already. I do think there is a need for it. We do need these things. But I think when you hook that into point 2 around that kind of secure simplicity, keeping things simple, making sure that the basics are done right, I think that's also part of that same approach, right?
Yep. And that's what we have to start investigating. What is the data protection methodology that an end user is currently using? And not only the data protection methodology, such as a Haiku or a Rubrik or Cohesity or a Veeam or a Commvault or whoever that might be, you have to think about the recoverability. You have to think about, how do I protect my data? Do I have data that has moved off site? Do I have data moved off into immutable storage? So, and do I have the right policy set? Is my legal team okay with the retention period for the data that I'm keeping? Is the data well protected? So there's a lot, but you also want to make sure you consider that it has to be simple. You want to make it easy for people to protect the data, and also to easily get it back if you are hacked.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting as well, because actually there's still, and this, it amazes me sometimes, there are still companies out there that we speak to that sort of say, yeah, we back our data up, we back it up off site, but it goes off somewhere. But actually, going back to that recoverability point, even if we could bring it back, we don't have anywhere to put it. We don't really have a DR capability. We don't road test it either, which is really surprising that's still the case, to be honest, for a lot of organizations. But I guess in today's environment and economic situation, maybe it's a cost issue more than anything else, but it's quite a common thing.
It is, but when you think about the cost of a ransomware event, and you might be down for 21 days, and then your brand reputation, what's going to cost the business more? Protecting that data and making sure that you can actually do a recovery, and it's going to cost you, but it's going to cost you a lot more. And there have been organizations who've lost their business because they cannot recover, and they've lost the trust in the people that were buying their product or buying their services.
Yeah, LastPass is probably a good example, right? I'd be intrigued as to how many people still use that service.
When you look at, if you do a Google search today and actually search for who are the top 10 vendors for password protection, they've dropped off the radar, and they lost the trust in a lot of people. Of all people, you don't want to have a hack that's someone who is managing your passwords. Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think it brings in the zero trust piece as well, right? When you start looking at this sort of simplistic model, actually, and going back to that, excuse me, doing the basics right, making sure that only the people that should have access, making sure that application level passwords are locked down, making sure that people just can't. We see it quite often with customers that are in cloud, and one of their big concerns is bucket deletion. Yeah,
for example.
Yeah,
like making sure that we can't. If we lose a bucket in a storage bucket in AWS, we lose everything. Like, okay, you need to layer that. You need to make sure that the basics are done right, so you have the fundamentals in place, and that is password protection. That is the right access control mechanisms in place, as well as the backup piece, right? So, I think
I tell people, when you talk about a multi-layered approach, it's going to be taking things in consideration like snapshots, which is great for disaster recovery events, but are snapshots good for incident response? No, it's not, because that data is going to be encrypted, so you can't rely upon it. So you also need to have backups. You need to have the right retention periods. You need to be moving data. You need to have some of your data protection sets like snapshots close by, so recovery is quick. But you also have to have your backups, which could be local, but you need to also have them off-site or in the cloud. You need to have archives if you need to retain data for longer periods of time for legal purposes, where you can put data on legal hold. Then you also, very lastly, is to have it in immutable type storage to make sure that no one can touch it. So if you're using a cloud provider like AWS, it might be GCP, Azure. When you move things into immutable storage, you couldn't call one of those cloud companies and say, can you go ahead and delete my data that is underneath the time frame that I've set for recovery? They're going to say, we can't touch it until that time frame is finished. So if you set that immutable lock for 180 days and you're trying to delete it beforehand, you can't. You can even have one of the cloud admins delete it for you because it is locked down. So that is going to be the last line of defense, is that immutable storage.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's the same in the US, but the immutable storage piece here in the UK has been really, it's really had a light shone on it, I think, over the last probably 12 months or so.
Mm-hmm.
And I think with more and more people, we do an awful lot of work around object storage generally. So whether that's public cloud or whether it's on-premise objects, we do an awful lot of work with that, with particularly our larger customers. And actually, as a means of protecting that data, it's an extremely powerful tool. I think because ultimately what tends to happen is the ISV platform, so whether it's Haiku, whether it's whatever it might be that sits on top of the object store, it's going to chunk that data up. It's going to encrypt it. There's no file system for that malware to infect.
That's
and
right.
They're not, those tools aren't built for object storage. So actually a lot of what we do with customers when we're looking at these environments is, okay, it becomes more about what's the tolerance level? How much are you willing to lose? What's the kind of, because obviously with large volumes of data, continuously running backups or versioning is challenging, right? Just the change rate is quite tough to manage. But actually, in an object storage environment, it gives us the ability to start to minimize that gap between versions or snapshots. So you're really reducing the risk right down.
Yep.
Because what we found is that as long as it's in an object store, because the ISV layer is doing a translation from file to object, essentially, the malware, the ransomware exploit can't really do anything about it. It can't really make use of it. So it gives you that kind of air gap piece as well, right? It's just by the nature of how it works. I think definitely in the UK, that's been a big area for people in terms of investment, I would say, to try and move to this model. I don't know if you're seeing the same thing stateside, but
we are, and we're not even at the peak of, I think people understand they have to do that. Some of the questions that I ask people too is, do you classify your data sets? And why is it important to classify data sets? If I have a business, I'm going to have maybe marketing material. I'm going to have my developers that are using Jira to code on. You have salespeople. So is all of that data going to be treated the same? No, it's not. I'm going to have my databases that run my business are the most important. So I have to classify my data so I know where to place it, how long to protect it, and what risks can I take in having a loss of data due to a ransomware event. But sales materials, I might need to rebuild my sales materials, but if it's a database, I can't lose that because that'll lose my business. So classification of data is very important.
Yeah, and I think that feeds quite nicely into the process piece, right? So again, we do a lot of work with customers around data governance generally and privacy. And actually the amount of people that still don't classify their data is high, I would say. It's not that straightforward if you're trying to retrofit it. It's complicated because particularly at scale. But actually, like you say, being able to properly classify the data assets that you're running to then drive better performance elsewhere, if you like, and clarity over the risk is huge. And I think part of that also comes down to the fact that you need to make sure that, like, all data is not equal necessarily. So do we have the right controls in place for the right data assets? And I think historically people have always thought about it at an infrastructure layer. Mm-hmm. This is the infrastructure we have, and here's the layers within it, and this is how we're going to protect things. Or an application layer, even, like, we're going to protect this application. But actually, if you look at the critical asset, critical asset's the data. Mm-hmm. So if you don't actually control that and classify it correctly, that becomes, or it becomes less effective. We see the same thing for DLP as well. People that are looking to drive more value from their DLP platforms they've invested in.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, classification is a great way of supporting that. So I think that's really important. And I think as well on the process side, you've probably got a lot to add here. It is also about the process of, do we test our restoration? Can we restore it? Do we have the right controls in place? Do we have the right policies in place? And I think that's also a critical piece that people miss sometimes. It's not just tech.
Do you know why they miss it? Because they're so focused on the data protection software and also making sure that my systems are not hacked and accessible. But the one thing they forget about is the process controls, which is no longer software bound. It is now process based upon the end users to put in good processes to make sure that if they do get hit with a ransomware event, can they actually recover, which goes along with what you just said, testing that you can actually do the recovery, the validation. Some people, I'm surprised when I've done some of these assessments that people say, why do you test it out? I'm like, do you just test out one server, or is it multiple servers, or is it servers with dependencies? My core infrastructure has to be running. My database has to be running because that application is dependent on that database. That database is dependent on my core infrastructure, my DNS servers, Active Directory, and so on. So you have to think outside the box, and a lot of that is more process related. So when I ask people about data loss and how to get data back, they're now, if it's not documented, they're thinking on their toes, and now they're scrambling and they're paranoid and scared because where do I begin? Because now I have nothing available to me. So now it goes back to how good are the organization's processes when it comes time to do a recovery, not just on a disaster event. So I live in Houston, Texas. We are fearful when summer hits because it's hurricane season. A lot of people are very nervous about that. So I ingrain people's brains process, documentation. And you want to feel very comfortable that if you know a hurricane's coming or a tornado's coming through our area, that you can actually recover and go to sleep at night knowing I got my processes, it's completely documented, and I know I can recover because now I've tested it, I've validated my data, and I know it's going to work.
Yeah. And I think it's a big gap area for people still. I think you're right. I think it's a hope and a prayer is not a strategy, really.
No.
And I think that's some of the problem, right? And like you say, if there is, in that scenario that you just articulated, the people that may have been responsible, maybe you've got one or two people in the department that know what they should be doing, they've written the documentation, they're on point, or they haven't written the documentation, but maybe they're not available. So does everyone else know what should happen and how they should? And you're right, if it's not documented, you've got not a lot of hope.
I do challenge people when I do these assessments, and I ask them, I said, so do you have disaster recovery in place? And some of the organizations, the larger enterprises or larger commercial accounts, they do have disaster recovery drills they practice. Everything is documented, which is great. Sometimes they don't keep up the documentation. I say, realize that your infrastructure is dynamic. It is always changing. So if you have any major changes in that infrastructure, you better go through and update that documentation. And then after that documentation is updated, practice it and test it to make sure that it works. So those should always be living documents. Now, that would be disaster recovery. Now let's talk about incident response. That's new because of ransomware events and cybersecurity threats. But you now need to have a secondary process that is documented called incident response. Lee, I would say 8 out of 10 people that I do these assessments for either have not heard of incident response, or if they have heard it, they don't practice it. And if they do practice it, it's really not well documented. So those are things I think your organization can actually help people with, is to develop these incident response plans. But when you think about a ransomware event and you try to use my DR plan, is it going to work? No. Why? The first thing you're going to do is to fall back to the last known good snapshot or the last known good backup. When you try to apply that towards a cybersecurity event, that data is going to be encrypted and locked down or deleted or moved. And you don't know how valid my data is anymore. So you can't follow those DR plans. You now have to use something different, which is called incident response. Similar to DR, but it's going to be a totally different scale.
Yeah, and I guess it's always a problem, right? In this sort of scenario, from an incident perspective, how do you know what the last good version was? We all know I say we all know that the typically ransomware malware attacks, they're in the network for a long time before they actually execute normally. So you have no idea how far back that goes, really.
That's right.
So finding that sort of, as you say, restoring to the latest version might not solve the problem, even if you can do it. So it's definitely a challenge, And I guess the last point on process control, I'd love to get your view on this, is, so we talk about the documentation piece and those sort of things. Where do you see user education? Because to me, it's a huge, if you mentioned it a couple of times earlier, those social engineering attacks are more and more prevalent. And I wonder how much, whilst the technologists might know that they're a problem, does everyone else know?
No doubt. And I think if end users don't have that experience to do like the documentation of these processes, that's where they get hung up. Or they end up getting firsthand experience because now they're dealing with a ransomware event. And now they have to come up with, how do I go about fixing this? And now they're in break fix mode and trying to get things, running again. But now they're really not documenting that process as they go, and they need to. If you think about a hack, you need to lock down the production environment, stand up a secondary environment to get the business up and running. You also need to investigate where the hack had occurred, at what time, at what point, and how much damage was actually caused by that hack. And I'll give you an example, and this is real world. This actually happened. So this happened about 5 years ago. I wasn't working at Haiku, but this was an attack that actually happened up north. They ended up paying the ransom to get their data back. The first thing is they did not get but 75% of their data. They didn't get the other 25%. So they went ahead and they spent, I forgot how many days it was before they were actually up and running 100%. But it actually took them more time than they actually thought it was going to be before they were actually up and running. Now, they run their business for about 6 months, and guess what? They got hacked a second time. Same group. They were asking for more money this time. Well, you know what they didn't do, Lee? They did not investigate what happened and what took place and how they actually got in. They went in through the same way they came in the last time, and they hacked them again a second time. And that's not uncommon. So you have to investigate why, when, where, and how, and figure out where that hack had occurred, right? At what time and how much data and what was affected, and then fix those things so it doesn't happen again. But that was real world.
Yeah, and I think internally and actually I was talking to a customer about this recently. User education is key, and we go as far, and actually more anecdotally, the customer that I was talking to had quite a funny story about this. They would go through, and they would, from IT, from the tech team, send out essentially phishing emails internally. just to see whether the user population would notice and what they did about it, as a bit of a guide as to how well educated people were or weren't. And actually, one of the CTO I was talking to recently, he explained that he got in hot water with his CFO, because they sent out, just before end of year, they sent out an email to all the staff asking them to provide some information because it was related to the annual company bonus. And I had lots and lots of people respond. What made it funny, or I say funny, slightly amusing, was that apparently one of the people that responded were on a PIP at the time. And they said it did seem quite strange that I was going to get a bonus when I'm on a performance review, but he replied anyway. So it's kind of all of those little things, all of those training and education pieces that people need to put in place as part of that process, right?
Yeah,
I think that's pretty key. I guess the last point, and we've touched on this slightly. I'm not sure whether there's things to add here, but is that restoration assurance. And I think you touched on it when we spoke before, that kind of using the cloud, using or whether it's managed service provider or whatever it might be, as a kind of as a kind of buffer, if you like, to keep that second data, that offsite immutable piece. Is that something you're seeing more commonplace?
So when I'm doing assessments and I'm asking the questions, I treat it like going on a long road trip. And if I live in Houston, if I head out to the west and I want to get out of the state of Texas, it's going to take me 10 hours just to get out of the state. What I want to do is I want to make sure that my car is running perfectly. I got full tank of gas. I checked my tires. So there's lots of things that I want to prepare for before I actually get on the road and take this trip. And I tell people disaster recovery, incident response is the same thing. You want to practice those things. You want to make sure that everything is pristine. When I speak as an administrator, is I want to make sure I get a good night's sleep and have a nice weekend. And I don't want to have any surprises. So I want to have everything well documented. I want to make sure I test out as much as I can. I want to validate my processes and making sure that things are going to work well. So if an incident does happen over a weekend, I'm not going to sweat it. I'm not going to have to think twice about what am I actually doing? What has stood up first? Am I missing any components? Because I'm documenting this whole process as I go. And it's so well documented, I can hand it off to someone else. And this is what we did at Citadel. We'd hand it off to someone else and who is not even a database administrator and saying, here's my plan. I want you to do recovery for me based upon that plan. And that's how good it was. But we need to get people in the same mindset when it comes to restorations, that you have to practice it. How do I practice it? Let's document it and test it constantly. And I know it sounds like a pain, but the first time you do it, it's going to be painful. You update the documentation as you go. And then from then on, you should have no issues.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, that's great. Thank you. And, you mentioned a couple of times assessments, you mentioned R-score earlier. We thought it'd be worth touching on this in terms of how we're able to help customers here, or organizations here in this sort of space. The team at Haiku, along with a couple of other organizations, have kind of formulated
Mandiant, FireEye, so very well-known organizations.
Yeah.
We even leverage the cybersecurity teams at Boston College, since our main office is up in Boston. So we had a lot of validation, and based upon my experience, it started with me to develop all these questions, all these answers. But then we wanted to expand upon that. We had DCIG evaluate us also. We had the evaluator group evaluate the product also. So it just wasn't us thinking, hey, we're going to develop this tool internally and get no feedback. We certainly did. And everything that we do is based off the NIST protocols and standards. So we didn't do it in a black box. And it's basically 5 main categories. It's over 100 questions long, but it goes through very thoroughly, not just on what is the backup software you're currently using, what does your infrastructure look like, your security and networking, your processes, disaster recovery, the DR documentation, incident response documentation. A lot of this also is not just on the hardware software side, but also and security, but also goes along all processes. And Lee, I'll tell you what, that's where I think when people answer the questions, they get hung up on sections 4 and 5, because most of that is process and it's no longer software. Now it's on human activity. And one of the questions, and you touched on this too, was, do you test the end users via email? A social engineered attack, do you test people out? And I'm still finding that a lot of organizations do not test their end users. That's where a lot of the hacks are coming from right now, social engineered attacks. Think about people who have X, or they've got LinkedIn, they've got Facebook. Those social engineered attacks all start from one of those 3. They collect a lot of information about you as a person, and then they will draft up a really nice email. And even organizations, like you said, hey, we're going to click on this link to learn more about the 2024 bonus plan that's coming this year. But yeah, an end user is going to click on that. Guess what? You've now been hacked. So our support touches on a lot of that. It's based on a 0 to 1,000 scale. The higher the number, the better prepared you are to recover. Now, we don't guarantee because you get a super high score means you're not going to be attacked. Well, technology changes all the time. Artificial intelligence is causing more issues, but our score is going to give you a really good baseline score to see where you're at. And I think a lot of times that I've done these, people think they're going to score higher than they have. I had a managed service provider do this because obviously they manage other people's data and businesses. they were embarrassed by their score, and they put their heads down and say, "Oh, I can't believe you saw our score." I'm like, it's a baseline. You have to do this. You have to learn from this. You have to get better. But now they have that baseline, and they've certainly improved their processes, their systems, and some of the backup tools that they were using before they were using Haiku. They found out that the tools that they were using before, they were not up to par to actually get a better score. And I said, well, switching out that backup infrastructure with Haiku, you're going to increase your score 200 easily, no problems at all. Now, the process control, I can't help you with. That's up to you. But Lee, I think you have 2 or 3 people now who are certified using Earthscore, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And I think the more and more, the thing to me, and you touched on it, is you don't know what you don't know. And everyone looks at the technology and they say, yeah, we've got firewalls, we've got IDP, IDS, we've got NDR, we've got XDR, we've got email protection, we've got one of everything. And we've really invested heavily there. But there are, to me, as you say, the biggest area of gaps are sections 4 and 5. It's all process.
It is.
All testing. And actually, so being able to identify those gaps and provide advice on where to fill them, a lot of our customers are getting a lot of value from that. Because actually, you know what? It also doesn't cost a huge amount of money to fix those things, generally speaking. If you've already invested in all the tech stack, yeah, there might be areas of benefit. There might be extra things you can do, gaps you can plug. But if the bulk of the issue is process, people, they're soft changes, they're soft improvements that kind of get you along the way. So I think
that's something you guys can help organizations with. They're not alone.
Yeah.
They can leverage you as a resource or your teams to actually come in and help. So if there is no documentation around disaster recovery and incident response, you can certainly help guide them to get those processes under control.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's the same with you mentioned the classification piece, even through the data governance stack around classification, corporate classification, risk identification, all of those sorts of retention policies, all of those sorts of things. But yeah, I think if we've got people listening or watching the webinar that are looking for that sort of assistance, that want to understand where the gaps are, then the R-score approach is quite a beneficial one, I would say. And feel free to get in touch and ask for some more information about that. I guess we're up on time. I like to quite often, it's a bit of a Jerry Springer moment in terms of what if in your experience, if you could give people a piece of advice, like one critical piece of advice in trying to get this, I'm going to say least wrong. What would, in your experience, what would that be, David?
Since I was an administrator, so I can speak from firsthand experience, and also being one of the people who was responsible for data recovery, I would say you have to go through an R-score assessment. You need to figure out where you're at with the baseline to know how well you're protected to recover from any ransomware or cyber threat that might exist. And without knowing what that number is, then you really don't know how well you can actually do a recovery. You think you can until you go through this. I think when people who do take it, they're rather surprised at their score. But good news is, as everybody has said, this has been invaluable, and it's a tool that we love to have, and we're glad to have done it because now we know what our score is, and now they have a plan of action to go forward on. For those organizations who lack the experience or time to do it, that's where Lee's team can actually help you out and actually go through the assessment. But you guys are now certified. I'd say the plan of action for most people is get an assessment done, talk to Lee's team, and they'd be more than happy to do this for you.
Thanks, Dave. Cool. Listen, thank you for joining us.
Yeah. Say that either.
I didn't pay you to say that. No. But you can say it. You can say it as much as you like. I'm perfectly happy with it. but no, thanks for joining us, Dave. Today. I appreciate that. And yeah, really appreciate your input and some of your insight there. So thank you very much for joining us.
You got it.
And if people do want to reach out, you can find us at nephostechnologies.com, and one of the team will be more than happy to talk to you about what we do in this arena. Thank you.